with employment, provide them with community, provide them with all sorts of case management services at work. For instance, financial skills training, life skills training, and they had great success really providing a community for those folks at incredibly low recidivism rates, which led them to consider the kind of the next journey, which was, okay, well, we've managed to provide these folks with employment, we've managed to provide them with a community, but a lot of them actually still really struggled to find housing. Especially in the Seattle area, just the down payment to put down for a one-room apartment is incredibly expensive. So they said, okay, how can we give these people a step up so that they can get off the streets and into temporary housing in the hopes that they'll then successfully transition into permanent housing? So they actually worked with the city and helped create a fee for vacant developments in the city of Seattle. So they now partner with developers to provide folks with temporary housing in vacant buildings. So not only through Square Peg are they providing employment services, but then through their nonprofit Weld Seattle, and I'll send over this in a PDF after a call with more information about these companies, they are able to provide temporary housing for people. So that begged the question of, okay, we know this works, so how can we create a scalable and repeatable solution to be able to do this anywhere across the country? And that's where Pallet came in. So essentially what they have designed, as well as dozens of folks with lived experience in homelessness that now work for Pallet, they've designed a shelter solution that, as Greg noted, is incredibly easy to assemble, incredibly easy to take down. Another advantage is it can go anywhere that there is flat ground. So whether you're talking inside of a warehouse, inside of a building, on a dirt lot, on a unused sports fields, on a parking lot, we can set these shelters up anywhere you'd like. And we can also make a lot of them. So right now we make about 50 of them a week in our HQ here at Pallet. We could make up to 150 a week in this facility, and we can assemble each one in about 45 minutes. We do ship them in trucks, so we can fit 30 of our smaller shelter size on a truck, and then we typically send deployment teams out with each order to assemble the units. Alternatively, we have partnered with local organizations previously for deployments, especially in areas that we're kind of a little bit more well known in. For instance, Southern California, Oregon, we have several partners that help us with. But yeah, so that's a little bit of a background about Pallet. We are a social purpose company, which is somewhere in between a for-profit company and a not-profit company. We can't take donations like a nonprofit would, but we don't just have the goal of making a profit. We also have the really important goal for us is, one, ending unsheltered homelessness in the United States. And we also want to reinvest the profits that the company does make into people with lived experience. So about 90% of our employees here at Pallet have lived experience in homelessness, as I noted, and that's not just in manufacturing. It's within the leadership team, within the sales team, within marketing. So we have a really strong culture of not trying to solve a problem that we don't understand. So everything in our shelters is there for a reason, and everything that's not there is also not there for a reason. And that's based on what people with the experience of living on the streets has said what they would have needed in order to feel safe, what they would have needed to feel comfortable, but also what they would have needed to actually realize that this is not the final solution. This is not the end of homelessness, because we're not building permanent housing here. And that's really an important point for us to constantly be pushing, is that this is not the end of homelessness. This is stopping the streets from being a waiting room for permanent housing. Because at this point, the problem of lack of housing has gone beyond something we can fix in the next year or so. With our shelters, however, the way that they are so scalable and so repeatable allows us to state the lofty goal of ending unsheltered homelessness in this country. So that's really where we're at today, and it's what we want to do. How we're doing that, we are obviously the provider of the shelters, so we manufacture them, we assemble them. We are happy to provide consulting, and we're happy to provide ideas and counseling and meet with politicians and meet with local nonprofit leaders and come and visit and set up shelters. When it comes to an organization that wants to set up a community, when it comes down to what that looks like, it completely depends on the partner we're working with. Sometimes people just say, "Hey, we want shelters. Here's your money. We'll set them up." don't worry about it. And we say, wonderful, like we do some reconnaissance to make sure that the shelters are being used in a manner that's appropriate to make sure that people are safe, that there's the sufficient services are being provided on site. And then other times we'll work with an organization for months and join council member meetings and join community meetings and maybe even come and visit the site and provide site layout, provide recommendations on infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So really briefly, I can talk about what most of our communities look like. As I noted, the shelters can go anywhere there's flat ground. So for instance, we recently set up a community outside of an old city hall in San Jose, California. It's a family shelter community. So it's all 100 square foot units, which allow up to 4 people to sleep in those really comfortably. When it comes to other infrastructure, so a couple things that I can note that most communities have, including the San Jose community, is there's always a case manager or service provider that is either on site 24 hours or on site at least during daylight hours. And then if they're not on site 24 hours, there's typically security on site for the off hours that the case management and service provider aren't there. Most of our communities have things like fencing, and that's not to keep people in the community. It's way more designed to keep other people out of the community. The last thing that we want these communities to turn into is another tent encampment in a city that has, whether it be violence, drugs, trash, whatever that looks like. We want these communities to feel like a really safe and secure place for people to get back on their feet and stabilize and feel like they are able to access the services they need in order to, get better in whatever way they need to do so, and then hopefully access permanent housing. When it comes to bathrooms, there's a lot of different ways to go about doing that. I know you mentioned that you already have these sites that, luckily already have bathroom and oftentimes shower units on site. So we do have communities similar to that where they'll be in the parking lots of existing community centers or existing shelters. For instance, in the Poverello House down in Fresno, California, they set up shelters in the parking lot of their existing community. So that does lower the need for infrastructure costs when it comes to having bathrooms and showers and laundry, because a lot of those facilities already exist. Alternatively, the community in San Jose, as I noted, is in front of an old city hall. So there are no existing facilities there. So they partner with a local nonprofit called We Hope that provides bathroom and shower trailers. So they have a trailer, 2 or 3 trailers actually permanently on site there. Other organizations will purchase those bathroom trailers from from a manufacturer of them. Others will rent them. Others will have bathroom shower trailers show up, once a day for a couple hours, and folks are able to shower. The bathrooms are obviously on site 24/7. Sometimes they'll have showers that are there for 2 hours a day, and folks can shower if it's a smaller community. Make sure that everyone has the time to do that. So couple different ways you can go about doing that. Other kinds of infrastructure that is important for folks is thinking about access to services. So as you noted, food is a big thing. Box lunches is a great way to go about doing it. Communities will have a nonprofit partner that's providing 3 meals a day, or if it's more in a center location where there's already a food bank or food pantry nearby, sometimes folks are able to just utilize those existing services. We don't recommend that people cook in the shelters themselves. We do produce a 400 square foot community center that often is used for fridges and snacks and water. Sometimes groups will put a microwave or 2 in there to heat up frozen foods, but we're not seeing a lot of cooking happening in the shelter communities themselves. Obviously, for safety reasons, you have 30, 35 people all cooking in these shelters. That's a recipe for disaster for sure. So yeah, that's a little bit about our model. I can hop into I know that you've done some research on the shelters already, so maybe you don't need a bunch of technical information about those right now. But we have 2 shelter sizes, the 64 square foot and the 100 square foot. 64 is typically for 1 or 2 people. When it's 2, it's usually 2 people that want to live together, a parent, a child, a couple, 2 friends that have been living together for a long time. We don't recommend 2 strangers going into a 64 square foot shelter together, right? The whole purpose of this model is to provide people a feeling of safety and security. If you're being thrown into a shelter with someone you don't know, then that creates obviously a level of uncertainty. Yeah, you still have a locking door, but you're locking your belongings into a shelter that a stranger also has the key to. So not great on that. Not great when we see folks putting 2 people that don't know each other in a 64 square foot shelter, especially. The 100 square foot shelter, again, is typically used for folks that know each other, specifically families. So for instance, the San Jose community, families of 3 or 4 living on those 100 square foot shelters, so 2 bunks on either side. When it comes to other kinds of features and amenities that the shelters offer,
No.
is a big deal, especially in Ohio. I know that y'all have incredibly cold winters, and I think probably really hot summers as well. So there's a couple things I can speak to on that, and we can definitely go into the topic of what it would look like to try and put these inside. When it comes to the summer, I wouldn't be concerned. Most of our communities at this point are in Southern California. The materials themselves, the panels are made of fiberglass reinforced plastic. So they're very reflective. They don't have an incredibly high insulation level, but we were just visiting the community down in San Jose a few weeks ago. It was probably 80 degrees outside, so not super hot, warm enough to get an idea of what it would feel like. And the shelter itself, without the AC on, felt cool. So they don't heat up like a building heats up or like a car heats up. They're very reflective. So summertime, we do have an AC unit that pops into the back panel of the shelter. So we'd likely be looking at 5,000 or 6,000 BTU AC unit. So I wouldn't be concerned in the summer. The winter, we can keep the shelters warm enough to keep people very comfortable. With our cold weather package, which means we're adding extra insulation, we're insulating the floor, we're reducing some air infiltration, and we're upgrading our electrical kit to 30 amps and 240 volts. You're seeing the shelters maintaining about 100 degrees warmer than the outside temperature. So the shelters themselves won't be cold. Obviously, your electricity usage could be substantial. We don't have data yet on what that looks like, sadly, and it's something that we're currently working on. We have a partner here in California called Box Power that's doing all the power for the San Jose site. It's all on solar, backup generator, and battery. So we're hoping to have some specific information about electricity usage at some point, but obviously the usage in San Jose is going to be very different from what it is in Ohio. That being said, they will stay warm enough in the winter. Obviously, in Ohio, you have to think about structure costs such as snow removal and, what is this going to be a comfortable community to live in if it's 10 degrees outside and people don't feel like it's warm enough to go outside of their shelters. Obviously, we do have the community areas that are heated and they can stay warm, but I completely understand the concern about putting these outside in your climate, just based on making people feel comfortable leaving their shelter, especially at night, having to go use the bathroom, etc. So we could totally put these up inside. A couple of things to consider at a really simple level is just door clearance, getting the panels through the door. So we, if you're talking about a warehouse or, a large space with big warehouse doors, obviously not a problem. I can send over the spec sheets that have the exact dimensions of everything, but I believe you need about 10 feet. No, not 10 feet. I'm going to have to come back to you on that, of the height of the tallest panel, which you'd have to be able to have door clearance. The bigger issue here is fire. When we have the shelters outside, which is every single one of our communities at this point, the shelters are outside. Even in colder climates, like in high desert in Oregon, we have communities out there, and it gets probably, I would think, it gets just as cold there as it would in Ohio. Definitely lows just about, just probably at 0 pretty consistently throughout the winter. But yeah, so typically I got off track there. So typically we see a maximum of 10-foot spacing between shelters when they're outside. And the purpose of that is a fire block, and also so that vehicles can get through the area if they need to. And there's usually 12 feet between rows to allow, large emergency vehicles, but mainly you're seeing the maximum we see is 10 feet. Sometimes it's 6 feet, sometimes it's 4 feet. Depends completely on the fire department. That's usually a pretty relaxed conversation because they say these are outside, they have smoke detectors, they have fire extinguishers, they have egress doors, they fulfill all the requirements in emergency shelter building codes across the country. So they were built to conform with California's emergency shelter building code. So especially in communities in California, this is pretty standardized at this point. And Oregon is also getting to that point in which, these sometimes need to get inspected on site, which is not a problem. There's nothing hidden in the walls in here. They can get inspected as we set them up. Before we set them up, there's nothing hiding here that you can't see as you would in traditional construction. But when you start thinking about putting these inside, the conversation around fire changes. So typically what we see is that the fire department is requiring that an individual sprinkler unit goes into each shelter, which is not something that we can do, but it's definitely something that a contractor in your area could do. And it just comes down to the added cost of doing so, the infrastructure of doing so, of course, and then actually making sure with the building department that that is going to fulfill their needs for fire safety. We have done tests of our shelters when it comes to fire. When there's a sprinkler unit in the shelters, there's a technical way to put this, and we have the data on it. I'm not technical enough to understand all of it a lot, but their fire is not a problem when there's a sprinkler unit inside the unit. So it typically passes those requirements once the sprinkler unit is installed with those tests. So that's totally doable. It just comes down to the added cost of doing so and the space. So typically people are looking at doing this in a warehouse. There's always big enough doors to get it in. There's plenty of space to get enough shelters inside the warehouse. And you can be guaranteed a flat ground that's going to be totally suitable for the shelters to go into. So definitely some flexibility around that, and we're happy to work with you on it, and completely understand the mindset that comes behind that, and especially appreciate it as you're thinking, how can we make people feel comfortable, people feel safe, keeping them out of the cold in Ohio for whenever possible is obviously a great thing. So makes sense. Yeah, so that is, quick rundown of the model of the shelters. A couple other things I can mention about the shelters, in addition to climate control, some other safety features and building features. I mentioned the smoke detector, the fire extinguisher egress door. We do manufacture our own bunks here in our plant in Everett, which are custom manufactured for the shelters. They can fold up into the walls to save space. They can be flipped over to act as a standing desk. We also provide custom fit mattress pads. And one of the great things about all of these features is it's all inorganic materials. So when it comes to cleaning the insides of these shelters, it's incredibly easy to do. If you are careful of the electrical kit, you can actually hose them down from the inside if you really need to. You can wipe them down with a bleachy sponge. They're really easy to clean, really easy to sanitize. So if someone's moving out and someone else is moving in, we have a bunch of communities where the person moving out is responsible for cleaning the shelter. Sometimes there's the site manager, the kind of the facilities guy at the site will be responsible for cleaning them. But we've never had a problem with that. Unlike a wooden structure or other kind of tiny home, they don't take on any smells. So easy to clean, easy to sanitize, not a problem to have one person move out and then have another person move in the next day. They also, when it comes to putting these outside, and I'm not sure if that's totally off the charts, off the table for y'all right now, but they're typically staked in all four corners. There's iron rods that are staked in all four corners. Once they have 200 pounds of downward force in each corner, they can withstand about 120 miles an hour wind. So no problem for wind, I would assume, in Ohio. I think you guys probably get tornadoes. Am I right?
So we have one.
Gotcha. So we have a community going in Arkansas in probably a month or so. We'll have a community going in Texas, another one in Arkansas. So we haven't had any problems with tornadoes. I think that the building departments have been totally fine with 120 miles an hour of wind. Talking to people down in Florida, they're definitely like, that's not going to happen.
I have a question. Do you have anything in Minneapolis?
We don't have anything in Minneapolis. So that was the one community actually that did try and put these inside, and they got the approval for the fire issue, and they were going to put sprinklers in each unit. And then I'm going to be honest, I'm not totally familiar with the actual issue that arose, but they essentially had to back out. So there might be on our map, actually, there's probably still a dot that says community in development, but that is in development, and I would assume pretty far away from happening right now. But it's the one community that really tried hard to put these inside, and it sadly didn't work out. And I think that was more of a local decision and not so much of a this won't work anywhere. So I'm not too concerned about it, in conversations moving forward with folks thinking about putting them inside. But it's definitely something that we would want to completely be assured that they're going to be approved to go inside before everyone's putting lots of time and money into the project.
Okay. All right, let's get some time for questions in here. Who's got questions? Jim does. Katie
Yes.
does. Let's do Jim first.
So you were talking about putting this inside, and I'm just trying to understand the infrastructure that would be required in terms of, what kind of electricity do we have to provide? A power box, or inside or outside, I should say. Is there a power box that needs to be? Is there a kit that you sell that goes with this that can be plugged in somewhere?
Yeah. So if you're going to be putting these inside and you want each unit to have power, we would recommend going with our electrical kit, which is a sub panel that goes in the back of the shelter, with 4 breakers, which can run power to the heat, the AC, the light, smoke detector, and a couple outlets for people to charge appliances with, etc. Where that power comes from is really up to you. So we have some groups using generators. We have, a couple shelters outside of a church, and they're just running extension cords. They have either a spare outlet that goes to a 20 amp breaker, or they have a spare 20 amp breaker in their circuit breaker, and they can run conduit directly to the shelter. Outside, 30 amps, 240 volts for that upgraded kit, and same idea. You can run power however you like. It often just comes down to the building department, and they're going to say, this is how we want you to run power to these. So you just snub in directly to the back of the electric kit on the shelter.
So you talked about your process and the people that you employ, which is also intriguing to us. Is this something that you would consider manufacturing elsewhere besides Seattle? Or is that too far out in the future?
It's very far out in the future right now, but it's definitely something that we are hoping to be able to do, right? With the goal of ending unsheltered homelessness, that is a huge goal. There's more than 100,000 people experiencing homelessness in this country right now, and we don't expect to make all those shelters in Washington. So, every once in a while, a city comes to us and they say, hey, what would it look like if we wanted to get 2,000 shelters from you? And it's like, that's a lot of shelters, and at that point, it starts potentially making sense to be setting up a manufacturing center in a different city or a different location to fulfill more need. So right now, we can make up to 150 shelters a day in our current facility. So, whether or not we'd open a new one just depends on the demand. Shipping costs is actually just so minimal that, we could put 30 of our smaller units on a truck. And when it comes to shipping them across the East Coast, it's around $8,000 for the truck to the East Coast. So when you're thinking about the overall cost of a project like this, of a 60 shelter community out to the East, 8,000 is, it's not a big portion of that cost. So
sure.
Right now we're definitely, totally got our hands full in Everett, but it's something that we hope we'll be able to do at some point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Katie?
Well, Jim asked, my big question is infrastructure wise, what are we looking at? Where is the power coming from? So that's huge. And you answered one of my questions that I had going into this in talking about how much your company would be involved in getting city buy-in. Because obviously that's a huge part of this, is to partner with the city and to get zoning and building and all of those approvals, and to be able to have representatives from your company who would be willing to come in and have those meetings, I think, and be able to provide examples, I'm assuming is what you would be doing. Do you partner with land use attorneys? as
So
well? Have you found that you're able to go in and present to the city adequately and kind of convey what you need to get approvals?
yeah, so we're happy to be involved as y'all want us to be with these conversations. We haven't partnered we haven't partnered individually with land use attorneys. Typically what that looks like is once there is the political will in a city to make this model happen, it the conversation around land use changes from it being us talking to a building department and then saying, no, you can't do this. Like there's nothing in the code, in the building code or the land use code that says anything about this. So there's nothing I can do. It changes from that to when you're talking to a council member or a mayor saying, hey, it doesn't matter what zoning law says. This needs to happen because this is an emergency and we're going to figure it out. So oftentimes that looks like these going up on city or county land, and they have a lot more flexibility around zoning. Other times I was talking to a council member from out in, sorry, not a council member, a supervisor from out in Bernalillo County in New Mexico. And she was talking with land use attorneys, and they're thinking of going the route of, hey, if we put these outside of churches and they argue that this is fulfilling part of their religious mission, then they're going to be able to be much more flexible around land use. So those conversations are completely different everywhere we go. Pallet itself hasn't partnered with land use attorneys for specific cities. Usually it looks like the city or the organization is working with their attorneys, and we're really happy to get involved and say, hey, this is how this organization did it. This is how this city did it. You know, if we get far enough along in this conversation, we're of course happy to connect you with other folks that have used these shelters and gotten this approved. It's difficult for us to provide that information really early on in conversations because, to be honest, every single person I talk to on a daily basis asks me to put them in touch with someone who's done this before. So from our standpoint, we just have to be careful because, you know, we can't be asking people every single day to talk to someone. But obviously, you know, as this conversation progresses, if it's like, hey, we really want to make this happen, we have the involvement of so and so from the city and the county and this and that, it would be really helpful to get this specific information. We can point you towards someone who can, yeah. But yeah, that answer your question.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm actually a land use attorney as well. So
Okay, cool.
so that's, my head is always in zoning and building and stuff. And so, and knowing that those resources available, because that's really what helps in those conversations. So
100%, yeah. And it's really fascinating being in meetings where we were in a meeting with the city of Fort Lauderdale a couple of weeks ago, and there was a combination of building department people and then people in homeless services and elected officials. And the first question came from a building department official, and they were just like, hey, this isn't going to happen. You know, there's no way that we can find any part of our code or our zoning laws that allow for this. And we were just like, oh, that's really too bad. And then the elected official comes on and says, hey, like, I don't really care. Like, this is an emergency and like something has to happen. And, you know, to be fair, it hasn't happened yet in Fort Lauderdale, but
Yeah.
it will, you know, and it's just really inspirational having those conversations. And sometimes it is just an elected official that is, you know, throwing up a fight and, you know, it's for political gain. But other times, no, it's like people really make these things happen. Sonoma County called us, and within 10 days, we had shelters set up there and people were moving in. It's like it can be that quick when there is the political will to make this happen. They declared a state of emergency. They adopted the emergency shelter building code in California. They made one change to it so that our shelters would fulfill the need they wanted, and then it was done. And it's like that's the model of what we want to be able to happen, is that people see this as the emergency that it is, and there's the political will to make it happen, and it does. And obviously most of our communities take a lot longer than 10 days to go from a phone call to approval, but you're right. You know, the role of land use attorneys and have someone that is willing to figure this out is incredibly important because it's not written down yet, right?
Yeah.
Someone needs to figure out how to make it work.
Okay, I don't mean to rush this. We can either, we have 2.5 minutes left. We can either
Oh, sorry.
those
I'm talking
questions, or we can come back again if we have more questions. Tim, did you have something?
Real quick, utilities, who then bears the cost of the utilities?
Depends. Depends on the community. So sometimes it's the county or the city that will pay the cost of utilities. Other times the service provider that's managing the community will be given a grant of a certain amount of money. And they say, with this money, you have to be able to do this and this and this, which includes paying the cost of utilities. So depends on the community.
You were talking about sprinkler systems. Would that not require the running of water lines into these things?
Exactly. So that's when you really start seeing much higher infrastructure costs.
Do you have
we're
any
not-
example? Let me just ask, any example of where that was done, where your temperatures were really cold in the winter? Because I'm
So
thinking if you can't run them outside, you can't run them above ground in an area like ours, simply because they'd freeze.
Yeah, so we've never had any communities have to put in sprinkler systems in an outdoor community. So in that
Okay.
sense, there's
Yeah.
always
Okay, I have to stop because we're down to less than a minute. Let's just come back in. Cindy, you have
That
questions
answers
too?
me.
Cindy,
Yeah, a lot of my questions were answered.
we're gonna get cut off and then we'll just go log in again. I'm just saying that before it happens.
I
Oh,
just
go
wanted
ahead.
to know, you said that Minneapolis didn't work out, but is there
No.
another indoor community that did work out?
We don't have any communities indoors right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So are we gonna log into the same Zoom room here?
I think
Same
we're
code?
done. That was the question. Jim, did you have
We're
anything
done.
else? Yeah. All right.
Yep.
Let's call
We'll
it.
see
Thank
you.
you very much, Benjamin. I appreciate it. I'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Thank you.
so
Bye.
much. Really
Bye-bye.
appreciate it.